Time now for perspective. It's been exactly 60 years since the signing of the peace treaty that laid the groundwork for Algeria's transition to independence from France. The Evian Accords were aimed at ending a conflict that claimed the lives of more than 300,000 Algerians and lasted for 8 years. But France still struggles to come to terms with its legacy in Algeria. To discuss, we're joined now by historian Jim House, lecturer and head of research for French at the University of Leeds in the UK. Thanks for joining us, Jim. Let's talk firstly about the war itself. It's still a gaping wound in both the history of France and of Algeria.
Yes, absolutely. The legacies of the war are multiple. It impacted the lives of millions of people. One of the key questions in the French context has always been the use of illegal violence by the French forces. The question of torture is well known. On the Algerian side, there are continual requests from the Algerian state for France to apologise for its violence of conquest and during the War of Independence between 1954 and 1962. And so given that the war touched so many people's lives, it continues to be a real problem in France and in Algeria, and can be used for electoral purposes, for example.
And as for the Accords itself, can you take us back to March 1962? Now, the agreement, it did lead to an albeit controversial peace.
Yes, that's right. The agreements were a long time coming. The negotiations had started 2 years previously, actually. And France had wanted to hold on to the Sahara, which is where it was conducting nuclear tests. The Algerians didn't want that, so France had to concede on that. France wanted a special status for the million or so Europeans who were living in colonial Algeria, and it had to make concessions there again. And it was only really once we got to the start of 1962 that the French state changed position, knowing that because of the conflicts generated by the war, it needed to conclude peace. And so those agreements were signed in March 1962, and the day after they were signed, a ceasefire between the FLN, the main nationalist organisation, and the French state came into force.
And what about the longer-term consequences of the war? Its legacy is still divisive here in France.
Yes, that's right, because there were so many different people involved in that. There were the hundreds of thousands of French conscript soldiers who had gone to serve in Algeria, who came back and often retreated into silence because of the difficult nature of their experiences there. Many of the Haki, those Algerians that had fought in the French security forces, tried to flee to France in 1962 because they were being persecuted and very often killed by Algerians because they were seen as traitors. Up to 1 million Pieds Noirs, the Europeans of Algerians, came to France, and that considerably changed the electoral geography of many of France's southern cities like Nice and like Montpellier, for example. And the economic migrants from Algeria continued to come to France, in particular in the 1960s, because at that point it was relatively easy for them to do so.
Jim, I think we have time for one last question, and let's bring things forward a little bit. Emmanuel Macron, he has spoken a lot about Algeria during his presidency, but he's not apologising for what happened. Talk to us about that a little bit, please.
Yes, so President Macron has tried to appeal to different constituencies within French society who have made claims on the French government in relation to recognition for their sufferings during the war. And so he has, for example, admitted French state responsibility in the killing of Maurice Audin, who was a European in Algeria who was killed by the French security forces because of his support for Algerian independence. He recognised the 17th of October 1961 massacre of Algerians that took place in Paris at the hands of the French police. He stopped short of talking in more general terms about what colonialism was and what French colonialism was in Algeria, because there is pressure in France from the right and the far right for him not to do so. And so he's tried a juggling act, if you like, to appeal to as many sides as possible, which is quite a difficult political game to play.
Jim House, thank you so much for your time this morning. That's lecturer and head of research for French at the University of Leeds.